So welcome to today's virtual forum. The Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania is a statewide coalition working to increase safe, decent, and affordable homes for all Pennsylvanians. We work to fulfill our vision for a home within reach through state and federal policy advocacy, opportunities to connect, share, and learn from your peers, events, and our annual Homes Within Reach conference. If you are not a member, we ask that you consider joining. You can visit our webpage to join as a member, or you can contact us at info@housingalliancepa.org for more information on membership. Please save the date for our next upcoming webinar on civic engagement. It's hosted by our civic engagement team here at the Housing Alliance, Brian Fuss, Keena Minifield, and Jen Thomas. They will be sharing all the opportunities we have for our members and partners to own their political agency and advocate for policy for change. To register for this event, please visit the events page on our website. And of course, don't forget our conference. As the Commonwealth comes back strong in 2020, the Housing Alliance will hold its 17th annual Homes Within Reach conference in Hershey, December 1st through the 3rd. And we're working to ensure all Pennsylvanians are moving on the road from surviving to thriving. The conference has moved to the Hershey Lodge in Hershey, Pennsylvania for a more spacious setting. We, along with the Hershey Lodge, will adhere to all CDC and state guidelines in effect at the time of the conference. And in case you missed it, please check out all of our resources and materials on the eviction crisis by visiting our eviction prevention resource page, and stay apprised of what the Housing Alliance is working on by checking out our policy agenda. For today's forum, we're trying something a little bit different. Essentially, what makes a forum is that the audience gets to participate in the discussion, and we do want to hear from you, the audience. Throughout today's discussion, we will be posing questions to all of you using our Zoom polls and the chat. So when answering in the chat, please be sure to remember to select respond to all panelists and attendees so everybody can share in each other's answers. Today's virtual forum will run 90 minutes, and we're going to email you a recording of this presentation and any associated materials in about a week's time. So with that, let's get started. I think I might have mentioned or forgot to mention this in the beginning, but I am Gail Schwartz, the Associate Director of Policy and Strategic Initiatives here at the Housing Alliance. And I would like to know who all of you are. So please take a moment and just share with us, which sector you most closely identify with. Got a lot of homeless service providers and government folks, people from the legal community, some folks from the housing authority. It looks like a really, really diverse group is with us today. So I'm going to and Jihan, have we leveled off? Oh, we're sharing the poll results. So it looks like we have a really, really great breakout of folks with us today, and I want to thank you all for answering the poll. So now I am pleased to introduce the moderator for today's event, Phyllis Chamberlain, the Executive Director of the Housing Alliance.
Great, thanks, Gail. I want to start by sharing something with all of you. In case you couldn't hear the audio, I want you to close your eyes and hear the sound of a 3-year-old child giggling. It happens to be my 3-year-old child giggling in this audio, but not just giggling, using her deep belly laugh, which you heard a little bit towards the end of that audio. And she uses that deep belly laugh fairly often when she thinks something is super hysterical. She thinks sneezes are hilarious. She laughs with glee when she sees a school bus drive by. She loves jumping in puddles and playing in the rain, which I will admit does not always make me that happy until I see how happy she is. And when we drive over railroad tracks, she tries to replicate the sound that the car makes by shouting, boom, 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 boom. It is her nature, of course, in part, that makes her such a happy child. But we all know that environment plays a really big role as well. My daughter's happy because we have a safe and stable place to live. She doesn't have to be stressed herself or see or feel my stress about where we're going to live or how we're going to pay for basic necessities like rent or food or childcare. When we think about what it means to have a good life, we know that housing provides the foundation for just about all of it, for our health, for our education, for our ability to move up the economic ladder, and for Black and Brown households for racial equity. Every family deserves that, to have the opportunity to raise their children in a safe and stable home, to be able to give their children the stability that housing provides. With the pandemic and the economic shutdown, all of a sudden, there were thousands of renter households who were unable to pay their rent. And organizations on the front lines here in Pennsylvania, and we know all across the country, jumped into action to prevent an anticipated massive eviction crisis. And as a result of that incredible energy and collaboration, we have more programs in place here in Pennsylvania than ever before that provide better ways to resolve the dispute between tenants and landlords without an eviction. The difficulty in paying rent for those making low wages, we know, doesn't go away when the pandemic ends. So today we're here to launch a statewide initiative to reduce evictions with a focus on non-payment of rent here in Pennsylvania. You are already doing so much of this work. You are the experts, and what we aim to do is to channel that expertise and that energy into a coordinated and greater level of advocacy for funding, advocacy for better state policy, and a significant expansion of programs that avoid an eviction by stabilizing renters and by making landlords whole. With an eviction filing on one's record, a family has a hard time convincing a landlord to rent them a new place to live. And what tends to happen is that family has to find housing that isn't as of good quality and is in a worse off neighborhood with higher poverty rates and less access to good schools, to good food, and to accessible transportation. And when tenants are unable to pay, we know that landlords struggle too. If landlords don't have reliable rental income, they're unable to meet their own financial and maintenance obligations. Reducing evictions is a bold and ambitious goal. So what do we need to be able to meet this goal? We need money. There's a lot of federal funding coming into Pennsylvania for rental assistance, but we need ongoing funding sources for rental assistance and a variety of supportive services. And we need these resources to have few to no restrictions on either the tenant or the landlord. And what this will do is to allow those administering the funds at the local level, working so hard to get those funds out the door quickly, to have maximum flexibility to be able to help tenants and landlords. We also need to center the perspectives and needs of both tenants and landlords into the strategies we implement. Some landlords do use an eviction filing as a rent collection method. We have to make the case that there are better alternatives to filing an eviction that stabilizes the tenant, but also meets the landlord's business needs. And we need more landlords to help us spread that message. We also know that many tenants leave their homes before the eviction proceeds through the court system, which could be an arduous and overwhelming process. We need more tenant organizing, and we need to support more tenant organizing and tenant outreach, which can help tenants understand the help that's available and can support them to understand their rights. And we need leadership at all levels, and that's where we all come in. Today, we're going to highlight the strategies that have been created here in Pennsylvania to avoid an eviction that can be created and must be expanded all across the state. By combining these strategies, we will have a comprehensive community approach to reduce the number of evictions. We have a really great lineup of speakers today, including local and national experts. And I'm going to pass it back to Gail Schwartz, the Housing Alliance's internal expert on this issue. Many of you work with Gail and know what an incredible leader she has been. So Gail, I'm going to pass it to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am going to share my screen real quick, so bear with me. Before we get into our next part, I want to remind folks that we are going to be posing questions to you throughout, so please use the chat to answer. And the first question that I have for all of you and want to hear from all of you is, why does an eviction prevention matter to you? So please take a moment and just answer in the chat in 1 to 2 words why this matters, what brought you here, and we will be already seeing some really, really great answers. Stability is a very common theme. Health, safety, justice, preserving community. These are all some really, really, really great answers. I'm going to give it another second or two for people to continue to submit their answers. Great. So while people are continuing to submit their answers, I want to go ahead and introduce this section of today's forum where we're going to have a discussion on the 5 strategies. Often landlords and tenants' needs are viewed as being at odds, that you have to be on one side or the other, and that one side can only get what they need at the sacrifice of the other. I do not believe this to be true. I believe that we all have the same common goal when it comes to rental housing. We all want tenants living in a quality, fair-priced home who can make their rent and be a good neighbor for years at a time. But when you have more than 100,000 eviction filings happening annually in Pennsylvania alone, it becomes evident that eviction is not the result of bad choices or bad tenants or bad landlords. It is the result of a system that is failing to address the common barriers to housing stability. Eviction is not a singular event or action. It is, in fact, a legal process with several different phases that can take as little as a few weeks. But there is opportunity to intervene during this process and help stabilize the renter, restore the landlord-tenant relationship, and avoid traumatic displacement. But as you can see by this image, there's a lot of pieces and a lot of nuance. And we'll be sure to share this with folks after today's presentation. So research shows that by implementing 5 strategies to prevent eviction, we can disrupt the cycle of crisis and poverty that eviction perpetuates. And we have some amazing speakers to share where those strategies are already working in Pennsylvania. The first strategy we would like to discuss is connecting to and providing crisis support to tenants at the first sign of trouble. It is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Kina Minifield. Kina is a Policy and Civic Engagement Associate at the Housing Alliance and will be speaking on the difference outreach and providing wraparound supports can have for tenants.
Thank you, Gail, for giving me the opportunity to tell my story today. Eviction has been an ongoing issue for tenants for decades, and I tell my story today to say that there are thousands of other stories out there like mine. I have 2 separate experiences of not being able to pay rent. One experience is with an apartment complex I rented from when I was 19. The eviction experience I had as a new adult shaped my life for the 7 years after that eviction. I was unable to pay rent because the job market at the time was terrible, and I had to find childcare for a 1-year-old and a 1-month-old on top of that. Being 19, I had no idea what resources were out there for me to get help with rent, a job, or daycare. And it didn't even come to mind to ask, to get those resources. The apartment complex put a 30-day notice on my door, and I panicked. I didn't have the money to pay, so I just moved out and went to a different state to live with my mom. The apartment complex still put a $1,400 judgment on me, even though I moved out. That $1,400 judgment was on my record for 7 years. So that's basically my whole adult life. It didn't matter if I had paid it off, which it took me years to do that. It was still on there. My whole adult life, I had the toughest time trying to find stable housing because of that judgment. I would have loved if the apartment complex had put some resources with that notice on my door on where I could receive help to pay rent, or any legal help resources to stay in my apartment. I could have stayed and gotten help rather than having to leave everything and starting over. This is most people, and it's prevalent now more than ever. The eviction process is one that most people don't know about, and helping renters understand their rights and what help is out there is so essential. My other experience happened in 2016 due to a former partner fighting a horrible opioid addiction. He was working, he was the breadwinner and paid the bills. And I was in school part-time working on obtaining my associate's degree. We rented from a private landlord who thankfully was extremely understanding with me when my former partner moved out and I had to find a part-time job. That job didn't even pay the bills, and I had to max out on student loans each semester to pay rent. But that only lasted so long. In the summer, I ran out of money and I let my landlord know. Luckily, he didn't go through the courts, and I once again just moved out, but into a 30-day shelter. And from there, I was connected to supports that I needed, such as access to transitional housing, daycare assistance, which came in handy so I could go to school full time and actually finish my degree while working. And I got food, clothing, and furniture vouchers. And a year later, I got into public housing. So both of those programs allowed my rent to be no more than 30% of my income, which came as a huge help and allowed me to have money for other things. The feeling of having support this time around compared to the first time around is night and day. It was hard for me to become motivated when I had to be in survival mode all the time. The last time around, I could sleep at night knowing I was secure, and I wish that everyone felt that way. And fast forward 4 years later, here I am. I'm employed with the Housing Alliance, and I'm so grateful to be part of a team that fights to prevent evictions with mediation, while sharing resources for legal and rental assistance programs, as well as wraparound services for tenants. With the services and supports I received the last time around, I was able to thrive. In 4 years, I became a first generation degree holding homeowner as of February. And I plan to keep fighting the good fight with the Housing Alliance and making sure everyone has the proper resources and help to stay in their homes, and working with landlords to create win-win situations. I thank you for listening, and I will give it back to you, Gail.
Thank you, Kina. Your experience is a powerful lesson to us all on the impact quickly connecting tenants to housing supports can have. Outreach with connection to supports can give people the stable foundation to build towards their life goals. So with that, I want to pose my next question to all of you. So I'm going to share my screen. And my question to you, if you could please answer in the chat and remember to share with all panelists and attendees, are you currently working on tenant outreach? And if so, what are the biggest challenges that you're seeing? Great, we're seeing some great responses. Of course, you know, it's always a challenge in working with folks that are having to move a lot, phone numbers changing, contact information, people being scattered, that sort of thing. So we have some great challenges, but I think if we work together, we have an opportunity for great outcomes. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen again and introduce or move on to our next strategy. So the next strategy we are going to discuss is landlord-tenant outreach. Research has shown that eviction negatively impacts landlords as well as tenants. Landlords, often operating on tight margins, lose necessary income, impacting their ability to meet their own financial and operational obligations, including repairs and maintenance. When we broker partnerships with landlords, we can develop better solutions to help tenants while ensuring landlords have their basic business needs met as well. Unfortunately, our next speaker, Leah Sailhammer, the Vice President of Government Affairs with the Pennsylvania Apartment Association, was unable to join us today due to being sick. So we do wish her to get well soon, but I want to say that the Apartment Association has been a great partner in advocating within their own membership to avoid strategies like filing an eviction as a rent collection strategy. They've been working with us to promote mediation as an alternative to filings. And generally, they've been coming together on common ground to find solutions to meet the needs of both landlords and tenants during the pandemic. So I am going to share my screen again and pose my next question to all of you. And that question is, do you have a landlord outreach effort? And if so, what are the biggest challenges? And of course, please share your answers in the chat and make sure that you reply to all attendees so that we can see, you guys can share with each other some of the biggest challenges. But yes, the cost of units is hard. Many landlords are frustrated right now, dealing with a lot of debt from their tenants. They're resistant to work with programs. There are trust issues. Getting the word out about programs. Landlords have become numb. I'm hearing a lot of that from partners. Well, this is some really, really great feedback, and I want to thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing, but feel free to keep adding comments. And I want to discuss our next strategy. So the next strategy is strategy 3, ongoing rental assistance. We know that in order for people to be stable in housing, they have to be able to pay the rent in full. With the outbreak of COVID-19, we have seen a proliferation of emergency rental assistance programs across the state and country operating with unprecedented flexibility. And while many of these programs are limited to the pandemic, it does give us a great opportunity to experiment and evaluate what we could be doing differently and better long-term. I would like to introduce our next speaker, Claudia Aiken, Director of the Housing Initiative at Penn. Her research focuses on housing policy in the context of declining federal resources, racial and socioeconomic inequity, and neighborhood change.
Thanks, Gail, and thank you so much to the Housing Alliance for having me. So I want to talk a little bit about the research that HIP does around emergency rental assistance programs, which really kicked off last year. Back in the spring, we formed partnerships with Philadelphia, of course, but also other cities around the country, Baltimore, Atlanta, Oakland, and Los Angeles, to kind of, we wanted at first to provide just data and analysis that would inform their very first iterations of emergency rental assistance. And as those programs got off the ground, our partners really urgently asked questions like, are we effectively serving the most vulnerable households? Who is getting hung up in the application process, and where is that happening? And importantly, what impact does rental assistance have on tenants? And how much of the need are we actually meeting with these programs? So what HIP did was we began to study these programs in a formal way, mainly using longitudinal surveys of tens of thousands of tenants who apply. Basically, we survey the tenants when they initially submit an application and then follow up multiple times to see how receiving the assistance or not affects a whole range of outcomes. And in some of our sites, we've also expanded to surveying landlords as well, because one of the challenges that emerged early on, of course, was that landlords were either not responding to or outright declining to participate in these programs. And we wanted to understand why that might be and whether that choice varied by the type of landlord, especially small versus large landlords. Other jurisdictions heard about what we're doing, and we've since gone on to partner with the County of Los Angeles and now the state of California as well, which has a multi-billion-dollar program that's serving lots and lots of tenants statewide. And parallel to this very local research, we've also been collaborating with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and the NYU Furman Center to research the landscape of ERA programs across the country, again, using a series of surveys and also interviews with program administrators. So what I want to spend my remaining couple of minutes talking about is this national research around some of these key challenges and strategies which directly affect access to emergency rental assistance, especially among those with less formal housing situations. And the top challenge we found, cited by survey respondents, is incomplete applications. And when we dove into this issue, it became clear that application incompleteness is really the result of two things. First, the fact that many of the application processes for these programs started out being just too long, too complex, requiring documentation that many applicants found it hard to provide. But the second issue is tenant responsiveness. Essentially, tenants would fill out the initial screening, but then not respond to requests for follow-up documentation or clarification. So we've seen administrators respond to these challenges in a variety of ways. Of course, shortening and simplifying applications was a big step. Many are offering lots of great supports to applicants to help them go through the process. And many have also moved towards allowing self-attestation rather than documentation of things like income, COVID-19 hardship, and other things. But the other half of the equation, tenant responsiveness, does remain a key challenge. We found in our latest survey that half of programs cite this challenge. And a related challenge, as I mentioned, is landlord responsiveness, which is also cited by over half of respondents. Funding guidelines have shifted to make it easier to give money directly to tenants, especially when the landlord is unresponsive. But surprisingly, we've seen programs reluctant to kind of adopt that strategy. Much more common has been to reduce the requirements for landlords to participate. These requirements are usually things like waiving late fees, forgiving back rent, or suspending evictions. And interestingly, our landlord surveys have found that large landlords are more likely to view these kinds of requirements as unreasonable. But small landlords, which may be more open to these kinds of things, are less able to afford them financially. And of course, one of the big risks is that if you take these requirements away, landlords will accept the assistance maybe, but then still evict their tenant or charge them late fees. And there are so many more findings I would love to share with you, but for now, I'll just refer you to our website, www.housinginitiative.org, where you can find lots more on this topic. And thank you again.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you for all the amazing research you are doing on ERAP and rental assistance. It's just been such a great resource for advocates like me and for the program designers and administrators and workers themselves. So with that, I want to pose the next question to all of you in the audience. So we know everybody's got an ERAP program, but we also want to know, has anybody tried to create a local rental assistance program besides ERAP, maybe using a funding source like CDBG? And if so, what are the biggest challenges that you're running into in either getting it started or keeping it going? Anything like that. So again, please put your answers into the chat. We see, oh, somebody doesn't know what ERAP is. ERAP is the Emergency Rental Assistance Program that was created as part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, and then it was expanded through the American Rescue Plan, but it's the emergency rental assistance that's available right now. That just started in the spring. So we see not enough funding, of course, finding units to work with those assistance programs, funding constraints. Yeah, affordable housing is disappearing. Well, thank you for all of those great responses. I'm going to stop sharing, but please feel free to continue to comment. The next strategy we are going to discuss is strategy 4, landlord-tenant mediation. Landlord-tenant mediation is an effective tool to address landlord-tenant disputes, avoid court involvement, and help identify the root cause of the tenant's crisis. Our next speaker, Evelyn Wald, Executive Director, Center for Alternatives in Community Justice, has more than 25 years of experience as a trained mediator. And she has been working to expand landlord-tenant mediation in rural counties in Pennsylvania since the pandemic has started. Evelyn?
Thank you, Gail. And I would also like to thank the Housing Group for all of the amazing support that they've given to all of us that are doing these initiatives over the last few months. So a lot of times, and when I was listening to Claudia about the research, you know, we heard about large cities, and Pennsylvania certainly has large cities, but it also has lots of small rural areas. So I am right in the center in State College, which is the main campus of Penn State University. But if I drive 10 to 12 miles in any direction, I'm in rural Pennsylvania. And a lot of the landlords that are here in State College are large property owners. and they tend to be more challenging and less resistant to our programs. And then if we go out into rural areas, there's a lot more what we kind of call mom and pop folks. And as Kina kind of indicated, they can sometimes be a little more flexible and maybe develop better relationships with their tenants, and therefore, you know, want to do what they can. But as Gail said, they also have issues of meeting their own bills. So as she said, CACJ, our organization, has been doing mediation in this area for a long, long time. As a matter of fact, several decades ago, we literally sat in court with volunteer mediators right there ready to do mediation for landlord, tenant, or contractors or neighborhood disputes. And we did that for a while, but then the funding ran out. So what I want to say to you is you can implement a landlord-tenant mediation program and maybe easier than you think. Thanks to the Housing Alliance, we actually were contacted by Blair County, and we provided mediation training to 8 folks there so that they could launch their own landlord-tenant program. Here in Center County, in our organization, all of our mediators, other than myself, are volunteers. So they're people who are really committed to this process. Anyone who goes through landlord-tenant mediation, there's no charge to them. We encourage them perhaps to make a donation to our organization, but I think all of those things really help folks. We face the same challenges that people have put forth already, and that is the challenge to get landlords to engage, as well as tenants. We have lots of organizations that we collaborate with, that do housing, that do case management, et cetera. So folks are aware of our programs, but being aware and using the programs are always challenging. We also have a limited amount of low-income housing, and that's always been an issue for our area. So one of the things that I would say to you is we're constantly reaching out, constantly trying to connect. We are currently working with our local borough through CDBG funds, specifically for folks in the borough facing eviction because of COVID-19. And even with that outreach, we're not getting very many folks. And we'd like to say we anticipate when the moratorium is lifted, we'll have a flood of people, but I doubt whether that's going to happen. We do use marketing. We've done press releases. We sent 1,800 postcards to tenants that live in the area, sent emails to landlords. So, you know, I encourage you, don't lose heart. You know, we keep plodding forward, and what we all need is a few cases of satisfied landlords and satisfied tenants. The last thing I'll say is the place that we began even way back when we were doing mediation in the courts is to contact our magisterial district justices. And even if you only have one, that's behind you in the program, you've got one. And so our local borough MDJ is going to remind landlords when they do come that we have this mediation program, and he has information to give them. So again, you can do this program in small rural areas, and we, CACJ, are happy to help. We've actually might be reaching out to some other local counties. So network, collaborate, which I know we all do anyway. And again, kudos to the Housing Alliance for all the materials that they provided, including landlord toolkits, et cetera, which I know they will make available to everyone. So thank you for allowing me to be on the panel.
Thank you, Evelyn. I think it's just been amazing the way that you've been able to kind of help bring a network of volunteers, trained mediators to the housing sector and help the housing sector cultivate this skill set within itself, especially in smaller communities that may not have the same depth of resources that you see in our larger cities. So with that, I have a question for all of you. So let me share that. Do you have a landlord-tenant mediation program in your community? And if so, what are the biggest challenges? Again, in these trying times, this, getting the word out and building trust with both landlords and tenants right now, I think is a challenge in many, many different programs. Well, it looks like a few folks are trying to get one started, but a lot of folks are coordinating with their legal services, which is great. Of course, again, getting people to buy into the challenging, a lot of misunderstanding of what it means to mediate. That's a very common one, and getting the coalition to get started. So these are all great answers. And again, I encourage everyone to continue to answer, but I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and introduce our next speaker. So the last strategy we have to discuss is expanding access to legal representation. We're going to be highlighting two examples of programs that have been able to make targeted partnerships with local magisterial districts to connect to communities that are most impacted by eviction. So let me introduce the first speaker, Ava King, Eviction Prevention Court Coordinator with the Friends Association. Ava started with the Friends Association in November of last year and works alongside two attorneys that represent tenants facing eviction.
Thank you, Gail. Our eviction prevention staff take a team approach. The team includes the district justice judge, the clerks, the landlords, the tenants, and of course, our EPC staff, as you mentioned, includes two attorneys and myself, the court coordinator. When the landlord goes in to file a landlord-tenant complaint, the court clerks then give the information about our program. Some district judges and the courts were concerned about being impartial, providing this information to landlords, but it's also explained to them that it's a win-win situation because the hope is that the tenant will remain housed and the landlord will get the back rent that is owed to them. So at the time the landlord goes in to file the landlord-tenant complaint, the hope is that the landlord will receive our information about our program and will not file the complaint, but instead reach out to our office and that we can work with the landlord and tenant to resolve whatever issues are causing the eviction. In most cases, again, it's because of unpaid rent. However, if the complaint is filed, the clerks will mail the landlord-tenant complaint to the tenants along with information about our program. This allows the tenants to reach out to us prior to their court date, but the clerks also provide us with the landlord-tenant complaint so that if the tenants don't reach out to us, then we make outreach to them. Sometimes a phone number is provided on the landlord-tenant complaint. If a phone number is not provided, then we actually go to that tenant's door to knock on a door to see if we can get them and explain what our program is. And we do intakes right there on their porch, or we get a phone number and call them later to do the intake. If the tenant qualifies for our program, they get free legal representation as well as financial assistance. Prior to ERAP, we had funds through our EPC program where we were able to assist tenants with back rent and sometimes even relocation. I make every effort to talk to the landlord after I talk to the tenant to see if an agreement can be made prior to going to court. If an agreement can be made with the landlord and the tenant, then in most cases, the landlord will withdraw that complaint and it doesn't make its way to the district court. We've established a really good working relationship with a lot of landlords in our area. They respect us and they know that if we're involved, then they're going to get the back rent that's owed to them. Because we've established this relationship with them, a lot of landlords reach out to me, the court coordinator, prior to filing for an eviction for their tenant and see if we are able to help them. Now that ERAP is in place, we're doing a lot of calls prior to landlords filing for the eviction, and we're doing pre-screening and giving that to our ERAP team to start working with both the landlord and the tenants. We're really proud of the work that we're doing here with our district courts. Again, our entire team, the district courts, the landlords, and the tenants. It's a win-win situation. We are working to keep our tenants housed and get our landlords paid, and everyone is made whole. So with that being said, I will give that back to you, Gail. Thank you.
Thank you, Ava. The work that you're doing is amazing, and the fact that you have this depth of collaboration with the courts, that they are mailing you a copy of notices as well, so you can go knock on people's doors, is such an incredible example of what partnership can do. And now that landlords call you first, shows what those great partnerships can achieve. So thank you so much for that interaction, or for that presentation. Next, I have another question for you all. So let's hear from you. Are any of you out there currently partnering with your local magistrates or trying to partner with your local magistrates? And if so, what are the biggest challenges that you're running into? We know that some folks have really, really great partnerships with their magistrates, and some are running into some big challenges. So any information that you have. I'll give folks just another couple minutes to answer. Let's see. The conversation with them. We need programs and dollars and outreach. Yeah. Okay, so these are some really, really great answers, and I want to thank you again for engaging with us. And I want to introduce our last speaker, Michelle Dembski. Michelle is a landlord-tenant attorney with the Legal Aid of Southeastern Pennsylvania, who has represented Montgomery County clients in hearings over eviction, rent repayment, habitability issues, intervention programs, and advises them on the CDC moratorium and federal rent relief.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Gail. So the program I want to talk about today is one that we've had running in Montgomery County. It's known as the EPIC program, Eviction Prevention and Intervention Coalition. It shares some similarities with the program we just heard about. Essentially, the goal is to create a program which has been created as of 2017 between Your Way Home of Montgomery County, Legal Aid, and the Montgomery County Bar Association, in order to provide tenants who are being sued for eviction for non-payment of rent or other reasons, same-day representation and limited financial assistance in order to prevent evictions and settle matters before they actually get to a hearing. The programs began in one magisterial district court in Norristown. It's since expanded to a total of 7, with future expansions in the works, operating in Norristown, Norton, Lansdale, Jenkintown, and Pottstown. So essentially what EPIC does is it coordinates with the MDJs and their court clerks in order to get the eviction complaints shortly after they're filed. At Legal Aid, we represent clients in landlord-tenant matters, but they have to come to us. If they're not aware of our services, obviously we cannot represent them. We don't just hang out at the court waiting for them to show up and need an attorney. So this seeks to actually cut that out by informing them. In fact, the magisterial district judges will send out a flyer about the EPIC program that goes out with the hearing notice, informing them that they can and should contact us If they don't, we have caseworkers that attempt to contact them and learn about what their issues are and whether or not they essentially can settle the issues. So essentially, they offer a one-time grant that was previously capped at $2,000 every 12 months to catch clients up on rent. The idea being that it is much more expensive to try to assist clients after a judgment has already been issued. And if they have already been evicted, there's a huge financial burden for them getting new housing. They have to pay moving expenses, first month's rent, security, possibly last month's in advance to move somewhere else. And during that time, they have to pay for temporary housing, usually at a hotel or motel. And many of our low-income clients just simply cannot afford this, let alone afford an attorney to represent them. So the same-day representation ensures that if there are any defects in the pleading or in the notice requirement or any other legal issues, that they'll have representation for those issues. If the issue is unpaid rent, we coordinate with the landlords in a form of conciliation, sort of an informal mediation, to determine if the landlord will allow them to continue residing there if the rent is paid, and if they financially qualify for our supplement. As long as they fall under or at 50% of the median adjusted income for their area, and intend to reside at the property and can make future rent payments, we will assist them financially as well. Epic does not have to be able to make them whole with our payment alone. They can contribute with their own portion from other sources, rent relief agencies, money that they may have saved, any other source imaginable. As long as the entirety of the judgment can be paid off or an installment plan can be agreed upon. The idea being we're here to bridge the gap to prevent evictions and stabilize their housing in the long term. And so far we've enjoyed just over a 70% success rate over a 12-month period. I consider this to be very good, which means about 70% of the clients that we take end up stabilizing their housing long term. This is especially important for clients who live close to or below the poverty level. They oftentimes can't really make up unexpected expenses, whether they be medical expenses, vehicle repairs, temporary unemployment, reduction in hours. These sort of things can hit them very, very hard if they don't have the savings. And then once they obviously cannot afford to make a rent payment that month, the late fees, the administrative fees, possibly filing fees if they have already filed for court, attorney's fees, they become insurmountable. It's a hole they can't climb out of. And so we're there essentially to prevent that. The Your Way Home caseworker will generally meet with them prior to the hearing. With COVID, since we're doing mostly Zoom hearings, we've been calling them long in advance, getting the necessary documentation from them and ensuring that they qualify. I will make a note that thanks to the rent relief funds that have come down, that $2,000 cap per tenant has been lifted temporarily, and it is now essentially 12 months of back rent and utilities and up to 3 months into the future. So obviously funding is very important for us and for any organizations that are doing similar sort of proactive intervention efforts. I know there have been many other counties in the state of Pennsylvania that have engaged in similar practices. Some of them are a lot newer than us and they're still getting off the ground. The success has been great, but it depends obviously on the funding. Thankfully, we've been able to secure that through Your Way Home and then through federal and state and county grants. And the pro bono attorneys who have generously donated their time, including legal aid staff such as myself, who work to fill in the gaps if no pro bono volunteer attorneys can be found. But the biggest benefit is once the landlords have a positive relationship with us, they know that we're working to reconcile the situation, especially larger landlords like apartment complexes. They're very much more willing to work with us. And in fact, we've had landlords that have been unwilling to settle with a client privately, were willing to settle with us because they knew that the check that Your Way Home would issue would be guaranteed and would come directly to them. So far, we've actually worked to repair quite a number of relationships, kept clients in housing along with their families, and are hoping to expand beyond the 7 magisterial district courts we practice in today. And I believe that's all I need to add about Epic. So back to you, Gail.
Thank you, Michelle. I think a 70% success rate is absolutely phenomenal, especially when we think about what the success rate is for a tenant going through the eviction process without any representation or legal support. So with that, that concludes our presentation on the 5 strategies to prevent eviction. But as you can hear, even though each presenter talked about one piece of the strategy, and in truth, they all kind of were a blend of all of the strategies. And, you know, again, while each of these 5 strategies that were just discussed in of themselves is not a silver bullet to prevent eviction, we do know that when these strategies are aligned and braided together, we create a holistic community approach to supporting rental housing that will reduce evictions and create better outcomes for tenants and landlords. But before we move on to our next section, I have one last question for the group. So I'm going to share my screen. And just let us know, what are you guys doing to using for any sort of eviction diversion in your community at any point in the process, if it's before filing, if it's after filing, if it's, you know, targeting folks who may be in that situation where it's a pay and stay, where, you know, the process is kind of ended, but there's still that last bit opportunity that if they, you know, make a payment to the landlord or come to an arrangement with the landlord, they can still stay. So yeah, just share with us, what are you guys doing, and what are the biggest challenges that your work or coming across in doing that work? It's been a really interesting time because, you know, of course we are all you know, been working under the CDC moratorium, which has had, you know, some interesting impact in how people are choosing to respond to these programs. And so I think we've heard a lot of that from folks, but we know that the moratorium is winding down. It's set to end at the end of this month. So it'd be really great to see or hear what you guys have. So just take another second and put that in the chat. Collaborating with agencies, paying back rent and utilities, of course, getting the most out of ERAP. Some really great strategies that I'm seeing, and some pretty universal challenges. That means that we have an opportunity for advancing universal solutions. So with that, I just want to say thank you to all of our presenters and of course to the audience for the really amazing participation that you guys have been doing. I mean, the responses coming through the chat are really great and detailed and thoughtful. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing. And oh, actually, I'm going to pass it back to you, Phyllis.
Great, thanks, Gail. And thanks to our great panel. As everyone can see, there's just a lot of really incredible work happening at the local level. So now we're going to pivot and talk about the federal response, specifically on eviction prevention. And we're really thrilled today to have Peggy Bailey join us. Peggy is the Senior Advisor on Rental Assistance in the HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge's office. Therefore, Peggy is playing an instrumental role with the Secretary and with her colleagues in shaping the federal response, both on the pandemic, but also on programs that HUD was already running. As we think about the work that we need to do, we know that we need significant new dollars, and we've seen a really incredible response from the Secretary and from the Biden administration. And so Peggy's here to talk with us about HUD's vision and priorities, and to give us a sense of what we might be able to expect to see from HUD in the coming months and years. So Peggy, thank you for joining us today. Gail, you
great to
can
be here.
stop sharing. And I'm going to ask you, Peggy, a few questions. So why don't we start with you telling us about the Secretary's vision and priorities, specifically around eviction prevention, but also overall, is there anything new that we can expect to see from HUD?
Sure. So thanks, Phyllis, and hello, everyone. It's great to be a part of today's event. I feel like I've been through maybe 4 or 5 different jobs now and working with all of you and the great work that you're doing on the ground. So, you know, as the Secretary likes to say, it is a new day at HUD, and I couldn't be more proud to work for Secretary Fudge. So overall, her charge to us is that whatever we do, we think about the people we're serving first. That our job is to make sure that HUD is working to protect housing for people across the country, not just HUD assisted households, but everyone. And that is the center of our work. It's what her charge is to us, and it's what you can tell from President Biden's agenda that's important to him as well. So once we do that, and then looking at eviction prevention, it's, you know, we historically, that it shows us what's new, right? Historically, HUD has not really centered eviction prevention or really talked about evictions really broadly much. And it hasn't been owned by the federal government at all. Evictions have happened in the shadows. Even formal evictions happen, and it's just another day, but it's a huge crisis for families. And so what she's charged us to do is to own that HUD is about housing and making sure that people are stably housed. And that means that we have to get engaged in eviction prevention and diversion. And we're able to do that because of the historic amount of resources that have been made available to address the housing needs for people during the pandemic. And because of those historic resources, it would be a travesty if we just dealt with the crisis at hand today and didn't use those resources to set up a better future for everyone. We know that evictions were a problem before the pandemic started, and it would be a shame if after 2 or 3 years of this funding, we were right back where we were prior to the pandemic. So what I would say is that there is a short-term strategy around eviction prevention, which is dealing with the crisis at hand. Not only is this a priority for HUD, but it's a priority all the way up to the White House, because, you know, the resources that are made available through the federal government aren't all administered by HUD. Treasury has the huge emergency rental assistance program, ERAP, that you were just talking about today. We have our resources, USDA has resources. So the White House actually has brought all of us together to make sure that we're dealing with the crisis today and putting all of the tools that we have in the toolbox on eviction prevention in the short run. But what this has highlighted for us and gathering the best practices that many are similar to what you've been talking about today, show that we need to set people up, because there are things that we could have been doing all along that we haven't been doing. And how do we spread those best practices long term? Start to do a better job of collecting national data around evictions. A lot of the charge that Matthew Desmond has been asking for years now, Congress is now asking us to do, and we can see the way forward of what we need to do. The last piece I would say is all of this is building toward, is part of why we need universal voucher assistance, right? If we had that, we would have had the safety net in place that people would have needed during the pandemic. We have data that shows that landlords that accepted housing vouchers, housing assistance before the pandemic are better off because they're getting paid. Residents may have had a little bit of a gap or may have fallen behind on some utility payments or things like that. But for the most part, landlords have been able to stay whole. So that ultimately is our long-range strategy of moving ahead on a universal voucher assistance proposal. And along with that, the supply priorities that are a part of the American Jobs Plan.
Great, thanks, Peggy. So there is a substantial amount. I think you used the word substantial. I think we keep using unprecedented over and over again for all of the resources that have been made available in response to the pandemic, but also have been proposed. But in addition to those substantial increases, there also seems to be a lot of flexibility that's embedded in those programs that's frankly unusual, maybe is the word I'll use, unusual. And it's not what those that are administering the programs are frankly used to. So can you highlight some of these flexibilities? And can you talk a little bit about what was the rationale for that flexibility? What does HUD hope to learn from it?
Sure. So that word unusual is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and it actually resonates with me and I probably will use this because it's that brought me to HUD, the opportunity to do what's unusual and different and really think about systems differently. And that is what overrides all of this additional flexibility that we've been trying to bring to the table. It is experimental to a degree. And we hope to learn a lot because we know that in order to get to that goal of universal voucher assistance, we're going to have to change the way we work. And if you think about it, a lot of the flexibilities and the things that we want you to try at the local level are some of the things that we think are going to be needed in order to properly operate a universal voucher assistance. So what are some of those things? So in the emergency rental assistance program, the two things that we're most proud of are the direct payments to tenants and the self-attestation. So being able and really, we wanted to make sure that landlord acceptance wasn't a block to tenants getting the help that they need, and recognizing that maybe someone might have gotten evicted from their where they were living already, and for other circumstances, and may need to use assistance with a new landlord. That was better. We also recognized, I think that some folks have mentioned, right? Not every tenant really wants to talk to their landlord, especially if they're behind on their rent. So being able to pay tenants directly could break through some unnecessary red tape in that piece. The other piece is self-attestation. My career is based in the homelessness space. And so documentation and the difficulty of getting documentation is fundamental to my thought process. And while maybe people who haven't experienced homelessness don't have that issue, I mean, how many of us have to struggle to remember where we put our social security card or where we have our birth certificate? So, and then with this piece, having to prove your income when you lost your job. If you lost your job, are you still in contact with your former employer? The employer is trying to work through their own mess with COVID and everything that's happening. So let's just let people self-attest that they need the help and get them the help as quickly as possible. That really is the foundation for all of the self-attestation. On the emergency housing voucher side, again, the documentation piece is key. And like I explained, we know that's for decades been a barrier for people experiencing homelessness to get assistance. And we just thought we have the flexibility. Let's not why repeat the mistakes of the past, really. There's also additional resources and supports for public housing authorities to be able to be proactive and actually help people find housing, not just say, here's your voucher, good luck, and move on. And that's going to be a critical thing to be able to learn from. Then there's the inspections flexibilities, the portability of the voucher, and the payment standards piece. One of the things that that I've learned along the way, right? People with disabilities have a really hard time using their housing vouchers because they need, if they rely on a wheelchair, they need a building with an elevator, right? And, you know, in places like Philadelphia and the East Coast, that can be hard to find, and you have to be in a new building that's going to be more expensive. So those are some of the things. And so what we hope to learn, as I said, are, you know, how do we, what are the barriers that we've been creating that have been unnecessary? And how, and then how can we translate that as we increase access to federal rental assistance in the future? We definitely intend to do that. I think the last piece that isn't necessarily flexible, it's more actually a requirement that I want to talk about is on the emergency voucher side, with PHAs and the continuums of care needing to work together. You know, it's crazy to me, right, that we have the silo of homelessness and housing when we know that housing is what solves homelessness. And so this is, I think, a big first major step from the federal government to say, you know what, this divide between housing and homelessness is crazy. And me actually being the senior advisor on rental assistance is evidence of that. My whole career, I've worked in the homelessness space. And so that is really center to what we're working on at HUD and in the Secretary's office.
That's just so great. It's just so great to hear the conversation about how do we finally make it easier for people to get the assistance that they need, and for HUD to be saying that just sets the direction for all of the work that we do. So that's really incredible. Specifically, still talking about flexibility, and specifically on the ERAP program, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. Here at the Housing Alliance, we've been working with a lot of the folks on the ground, the local governments and the nonprofits that are administering the program. And of course, this program is coming through Treasury, not HUD. But again, back to, it's just so unusual not to have so much flexibility. We're finding that sometimes people aren't sure what to do with all that flexibility. So can you give people some advice for how to handle that? Again, flexibility where people are used to being told exactly how to run programs from federal and state agencies. So can you talk a little bit about, you know, what to do when people are unsure of how to use that flexibility?
Yeah, no, we're definitely hearing that. And the first thing that I have to ask is that we kind of thinking about how to lean into the flexibility, right? Like my first advice is it can be scary at first, but to lean into the flexibility, because as I said, if we're centering people and getting things to people as quickly as possible, then we need that flexibility. The other piece is, I think, and what was great about the examples piece is the variety in places in the state and showing the uniqueness of each locality. And what we hope to learn from the flexibility is that, you know, it's used for good, because there's, you know, situations are different in every place. So my first piece of advice would be to lean into the flexibility. And if you are excited about the flexibility, you know, please be vocal about that, because there are a lot of voices that are concerned about how much flexibility we're providing. So I think the other thing I want to say is we also understand why you're concerned, right? There have been past instances where you've maybe gone out on a little bit of a limb, and then the federal government has come in and said, oh, cut that limb off behind you. And while obviously, you know, one, Treasury is administering the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, so I can't make any promises that way. And we also can't, you know, collude with the IG's office and the Inspector General's office when they come back to monitor the program. But if you read the guidance from Treasury, we have been very clear about the fact that this is supposed to get to people as quickly as possible, and that we want communities to do whatever it takes to make sure that people stay housed. And therefore, protecting all of us as you do that and making sure that it is very clear what the federal intent is around the programs. Obviously, you have to set up procedures to limit fraud and abuse, and we recognize that. But we were hoping that the language in the frequently asked questions in particular help signal to show you that our intent is to err on the side of getting assistance out as quickly as possible and doing what it takes to make that happen.
Great. So fair housing and racial equity, we haven't seen that as a priority in the previous administration. Can you talk about HUD's focus on both fair housing and racial equity and what we can expect to see?
Sure. So I'll start with racial equity. You may have seen, but if you haven't, you should definitely go to the White House's website and the executive orders that the president issued in the first few weeks. There are several that relate to racial equity. Broadly across the department, it is amazing that at HUD we haven't talked about racial equity in this way in the past, given that so many of our programs serve a majority of people of color. And so that, so for us, we regret that hasn't been our past, and we know that we've played a role in the inequities when it comes to redlining and other things that maybe not investing in communities of color. So being able to speak that and say that, sometimes a paternalistic nature of some of our programs has been an impediment. So being able to say that is a first step. And now we're trying to pivot to what to do about it. And one of the first things is in the fair housing space. And if you didn't see it today, I'm going to put in the chat. I think I can put in the chat to all panelists and attendees. The secretary had an op-ed in the Washington Post today on fair housing. So yesterday we issued a interim final rule to reinstitute and tweak the definition of affirmatively furthering fair housing. And it's a first step in restoring our commitment to helping communities advance the elements of the Fair Housing Act and make sure that and help give communities the tools so that they can affirmatively further fair housing. It doesn't change, we're still, there's not new enforcement that's coming. It's just us re-energizing the efforts that happened underneath the Obama administration. The other piece that's important to the secretary is resources to communities to help advance fair housing initiatives. Secretary Fudge is a former mayor. She understands the pressures at the local level, and that sometimes even if you want to do the right thing, you don't have the resources to do the right thing. An example of that is the zoning proposal in the American Jobs Plan, where we're taking a carrot approach rather than a stick approach to zoning and improving zoning at the local level, and wanting to give communities resources to advance better zoning policies, to bring together partners and stakeholders to inform those zoning practices at the local level, and put the seeds in place to make sure that we're creating affordable housing opportunities in every neighborhood across the country. But it is about giving communities resources, not threatening to take resources away, which we think is extremely important. There are other pieces of the puzzle in the eviction space in particular, being able to give some guidance to communities to help them see how eviction practices could run afoul of the Fair Housing Act and disparate impact in particular. And so being you'll start to see us talk about that, so that then communities can say, oh, we need to make sure that doesn't happen because HUD is watching. And when it comes to the eviction, diversion, and prevention space, watching communities to make sure that there's not that evictions are happening more to make sure that evictions are not happening more for people of color, people with disabilities, and other protected communities underneath the Fair Housing Act.
Great, thanks. So Peggy, your background is really as an advocate and a very strong advocate. And now you're working in government. So can you talk a little bit about what that experience has been like and what do you see as the challenges, but also the opportunities?
Yeah, so thanks for asking that question. So it was interesting, you know, I think for the first like maybe 100 days, I was like, I was very concerned about what I was going to say out loud that was going to get me fired. We were all like very much about like, can we say this? Is this going to be okay? Am I going to get fired? The other difference is the number of emails I send to the ethics lawyers at HUD to make sure that I'm not going to get fired for whatever it is I may or may that I may do. But really and honestly, that's one of the things that's great about working for this administration. When we have billions of dollars in place, it helps realize the things that I've been advocating for, and so many of us have been advocating for so many years. And that was what attracted me to coming into the federal government for the first time, and that I didn't have to fill out the USA Jobs application because I struggled to get through that in the past. But that's the one thing. The other thing is, it is hard, once you're on the inside, so to speak, there are so many things that you see the opportunity to be able to do, and we either don't have the capacity to do them because the federal government, especially HUD, has lost a lot of really seasoned folks over the last 4 years, or you just can only do so much in a day, and that sometimes is the pull. But the great thing is that the secretary and the president expects us to fight for people. And so I haven't had to lose my advocacy voice by coming into the federal government. And that's been a joy.
Well, those are some really great closing words. So I have the privilege of knowing Peggy and know what a strong advocate she is. So it's just really incredible to have you and to have a number of your colleagues and to have Secretary Fudge in this position and to have the federal government back as a real partner to everyone working on the ground. So thank you so much for being here today and for all that you're doing.
No, it's been a pleasure. I mean, that's the other thing that I should have mentioned is being on the outside means that I know all of you and all the people to bring into the table in the conversation. So I'm really excited about the next few months and the conversation we're going to be able to have on how to use these funds and what these funds are going to show us about what we should be doing in the future.
Great. Thank you, Peggy. All right. So next, we just have a few minutes left. And we want to show you the results of the word cloud that you all participated in the very beginning. Do we have that ready to share? Great. So, the point of a word cloud is to see what we say in common, but also what we say that's different. And so certainly what we're looking to do here with the initiative that we're launching today is to bring all stakeholders together, all the parties that touch the eviction process, tenants, landlords, nonprofits, local government, community leaders, to take all the work that we're doing, all the energy, all the programs that have been created, and again, channel that energy so that we are coordinating and increasing our level of advocacy for funding, advocacy for better state policy, and also for a significant expansion of the programs that we talked about today. So we want to talk about ways that we want to work with you in the coming weeks, months, and years. Can we go to the next slide? Next slide. All right, so I'm going to talk about media outreach first. We anticipate that the eviction moratorium will lift on June 30th as scheduled. And in anticipation of that lifting, we need to get the word out that the ERAP program, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, is available to help tenants and landlords. But even more than that, we need to tell the story of from the front lines of the eviction crisis. Can you launch the poll? So we're asking you to tell us if you'll participate. We're looking for tenants who have either experienced eviction or even better, avoided eviction because you got help. We're looking for landlords to tell stories about how you're working with tenants and how you're seeking better ways to avoid an eviction filing. And we're looking for organizations that are working to provide rental assistance or other services that are helping to avert an eviction crisis. And by telling us that you will participate, someone here at the Housing Alliance will follow up. Again, we just need to make this real so that policymakers and the public understand what we can do to prevent eviction and better stabilize both tenants and landlords. And I'll give people another few seconds to respond. Great, next request for you. So that was media. The second is advocacy. We need help making the case to legislators that there should be no restrictions on the emergency rental assistance funds. When the state allocated its portion of the federal emergency rental assistance program, it put in place a cap beyond what was included in the federal program. And that cap is just making it harder for the nonprofits, the community organizations, and local government to get that assistance to tenants and landlords quickly. So we need help from you in telling legislators all the hard work that you're doing to get that program to the people who need it. So talking about how you're doing outreach to tenants and landlords, talking about how you've created jobs, you've hired staff to process the applications. Again, making it real so that we can convince them to remove the cap on ERAP 1, which was the first pot of funding for emergency rental assistance, but also not to put any additional restrictions when they allocate the second tranche of emergency rental assistance funds, otherwise known as ERAP 2. And we're going to drop a link in the chat for how to contact your legislator. And please let us know what feedback you hear from legislators so that we can also follow up. We anticipate that these decisions are going to be made in the next few weeks. And again, we really need your help in making this real for your legislator. So that was media, that was advocacy, and now let's go to the next slide. Join us in this statewide initiative to promote the 5 strategies to prevent evictions, but also to advocate for funding and policy change. And you can launch the poll. So what we aim to do is to channel all of the hard work that everyone is doing so that we're more coordinated and we're increasing our level of advocacy for funding, for better policy, and also for a significant expansion of the programs that you heard about today. By signing up, you're committing to joining us at our first meeting that will hold in September, which will then initiate a series of quarterly meetings. And at that first meeting, we'll talk about what's already happening, what you're planning, and how the Housing Alliance can support those efforts. Nothing about the pandemic has been good, but at the same time, it's been incredible to witness the energy and the collaboration of the Housing and Homeless Assistance Network here in Pennsylvania. And I know that we can do more. And if we can reduce evictions in Pennsylvania, we give more children the opportunity for incredible happiness and joy. I want to thank everybody for participating today. I also want to thank my Housing Alliance colleagues who have had a hand in planning today's event, Gail Schwartz, but also Chi Hung Kim and Vlad Langu, who were behind the scenes. Thank you, everyone. We look forward to seeing you at our first meeting in September.